Well, welcome to this next session, session 2, already on the on day 2 of the summer seminar on the heart. This is the session devoted to the theme of feeling and knowing. Do the emotions blind us only? Do they give us sight? Do the emotions give us a unique contact with reality? This struck us as a central theme to be discussed in any seminar on question of affectivity. And of course, our leitmotif for the, or our epigram for the summer seminar is the famous line of Pascal, that the heart has its reasons which reason does not know. And so we will explore, in a certain respect, that Pascalian theme today. So we'll hear first from our great friend and increasingly a collaborator of the Hildebrand Project, James Matthew Wilson, a well-known poet and literary critic, professor at Villanova University, and now in his second Hildebrand event. And we welcome you, James. Thank you for being with us. Then we'll hear again from Maria Fedoryka, a longtime collaborator of the Hildebrand Project, professor of philosophy at Ave Maria University, and also an associated scholar of the Hildebrand Project. And then from Father James Brent, professor of philosophy at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C., also an associated scholar with the Hildebrand Project, and also someone with whom we are very much enjoying the prospect of developing and already enjoying the actual fruits of collaboration. So I thank the three of you for being with us, and we'll hear first from James, and then we'll work our way through, and we'll try again to get as many questions in as possible. And again, we will do our best to bring those questions that we cannot answer here today onto the closing panel. And of course, I would urge all of you who are our full participants and who are in small group discussions to use those small groups as occasions to pursue the issues that you all are raising here for us. So with that, James, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, John Henry. I'm glad to be here. Can everybody hear me okay?
Seems so.
Yeah, okay, good. All right. The time I'm going to spend with you all, both today and Thursday, I was invited to do some thinking in the company of von Hildebrand just about philosophical aesthetics and about the art of poetry. And so I'm going to have a few things to say. In my comments today, I'm going to begin far away from von Hildebrand and move towards him. So if 2 minutes into this you think, why is he talking about the poet Dana Gioia and not our beloved von Hildebrand? I'll get there, just be patient. So the title of this little essay I've just written is Sloppy Fullness, How Do Poems Know? And I'm afraid I don't have the talent of Maria to speak into the camera. I have to read my comments to you because I'm actually still thinking about them, so I don't have them in my heart the way I hope someday I shall. So. Only 4 years ago, the poet Dana Gioia made an argument about poetry that was, in his words, not merely unfashionable, but quaint, eccentric, and even disreputable. What was this premise, destined not to leave us shocked, but to invite our contempt? He proposed that poetry must be understood primarily in terms of enchantment. By this, he intended to recover the ineradicable roots of poetry in the chant, in music. And by music, he intended patterns and ritualized sound that lie beneath reason and operate independent of it. He cannot help but mention Plato, of course, who distrusts how poetry works upon us as if it were a kind of madness. He celebrates traditional ideas of poetry's purpose as to delight, instruct, console, and commemorate. But these are each actions of poetry on us, such that he can sum up his position by saying, all poetic technique exists to enchant. I believe that you can get this essay of Dana's on the recommended reading list on the website. And if it's not there, feel free to send me a note. I have a PDF copy of it. The implicit meaning of this idea, which is twofold, becomes clear by the end of the essay. Gioia offers us some gentle criticism of the mid-20th century new critics who made of the close reading of the poem an intricate intellectualist game that often overlooked the sound of poetry, its enchanting music altogether, and looked with contempt upon those who enjoy and understand poetry, not by discipline, but with the sloppy fullness of their humanity. In this, Gioia seems to separate music from reason, and the power of enchantment from knowledge. On the other hand, he calls on scholars to acknowledge and respect the non-conceptual forms of knowledge, exemplified by the idea of education as becoming well-versed. Have we adequately understood the enchantment of poetry then, when we come to respect what it does that is not reducible to knowledge? Or is it rather the case that poetry's enchantment is an alternative mode of knowing? I was led to think of these questions while reading Gioia's brief foreword to von Hildebrand's Aesthetics. For there, he observes that von Hildebrand's account renews the classical and Christian vision of beauty towards the true, the good, and ultimately the divine. What kind of mode of perception is this? It concludes upon the real, and indeed upon the ultimate dimension of the real. And yet it seems to begin, as Gioia himself suggests, in more primal stuff, sloppy and enchanting, rhythmic and non-conceptual, and prone to be murdered by dissection in the classroom. This is not an unfamiliar problem. In The Heart, von Hildebrand begins by observing that the heart and affectivity have existed under a cloud through the whole history of philosophy. Intellect and will belong to the rational part of man. The affective realm, and with it the heart, belong to the irrational part in man, he says, summarizing our usual assumptions. It seems clear that Gioia's argument accepts this division, but then also asserts that the irrational can become a source of knowledge. This question requires investigation in itself, but it also raises another about philosophy and its account of man. Charles Taylor, in The Sources of the Self, does what he does best, which is defamiliarizing and making visible choices that have been made, however accidentally, in the history of philosophy. In Plato, Taylor writes there, we find the decision for self-mastery as the moral end of philosophy, and as gained specifically through thought or reason. The heart exists under a cloud, as von Hildebrand has said, because the tradition of thought that begins with Plato defines the soul as intellectual, and the perfection of the soul as something accomplished only by the cultivation of the intellect. If that's the case, then we might expect Plato to tell us that poetry, with its chanted enchantment, stands somewhere outside of the life of wisdom. And of course, that is just what Plato actually does. It's now a cliche even to mention his talk of the ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy. Poetry produces an imitation, an image or appearance, Plato tells us, whereas philosophy and education, which are, as we just saw, the means of perfecting the intellectual soul, ascend from appearances to being and truth. From this, it sounds as if poetry needs to be left behind, or as the dialogue, the Republic has it, that the poets need to be exiled from the city of the soul, so that the soul may proceed undistracted to the knowledge that truly matters and masters. This is not the whole story, however. In the Republic and again in the Laws, Plato tells us that poetry does in fact play a role in education, or rather it plays several roles. The souls of the young are unformed, indeed so unformed that they, sorry, I skipped a sentence there. In the first dialogue, in the Republic, Plato speaks of poetry primarily in terms of mythos, of storytelling. The souls of the young are unformed, indeed so unformed that they can be said to be no more than to have a weak inclination to what they take to be the good, what they believe to be the good, what they view as the good. Storytelling in poetry furnishes to us, to the soul, images. It furnishes images to our unformed souls. And so, when it's good poetry, poetry gives us good images and images of what is truly good. When the poetry is perverse, however, it provides a perverse image that is not good and may lead the soul astray. At no point does poetry reveal to us the good itself. It only reveals images. The unformed soul needs to be planted with such images prior to its actually pursuing the good. Poetry's verses sow the pre-rational seed that once planted in us will allow us to search for the good and to recognize it when we see the real thing. How do we recognize the real thing? Because we will have first been planted with its image. What poetry shows us is imitatively intellectual, in appearance of goodness, but it is not the proper object of the intellect, which is the really good in itself, the good. Plato's not quite done, however. We measure appearances with mathematics, and insofar as poetry is metrical, with music as well, sensible appearances are formed to the measure of truth. And so insofar as we measure appearances, the mind also proceeds by means of the liberal arts, the arts of measurement, away from mere appearances and toward the real, the fullness of being. In connecting poetry to the liberal arts, Plato has not so much brought poetry into philosophy as he has found an intelligible connection between poetry as pre-rational seed image, poetry as part of those intermediary acts of the mind of mathematics and the other liberal arts, all of which lead us to, but stand outside of where we conclude, where we leave behind poetry and mathematics altogether upon arrival at the vision of the good. Poetry helps us to know reality, but specifically insofar as it provides material for the intellect to see, whether as image or as image as measurement. Plato's still not done. In the Laws, Plato gives us an account that to my mind comes much closer to Gioia's, insofar as it really does seem to describe what we would seem to mean by being enchanted, and which also gives a clearer place to the affective and to the heart in a way that will remind us of von Hildebrand in more ways than one. Music, Plato tells us, first descended into the world as a gift from Apollo and the Muses. The young are unformed, as they are in the Republic, but rather than being fertile ground that needs to be planted, they are akin to animals who move their limbs wildly and without reason. One of the many reasons we have to love Plato is the brilliance that it took for him to go from between one dialogue, the Republic, and another, to take us from a vision of the soul as vegetable to be planted to a soul as animal. These creatures, the Laws continues, they spend their time jumping and skipping about in a disordered fashion. That's certainly how my kids dance. But then they receive the order of music from the Muses so that their movements are subsequently conformed to rhythm and to harmony. The intellect is not given some specific content, image and measure that we know and see, but rather the wild instinctive feelings of the soul are simply ordered, brought to order, made to move this way better than that in a state of enchantment. Rather than seeing measurement, we feel measurement. We in fact become the thing measured. Indeed, as one commentator observes, this description of poetry is one where the individual soul is simply fitted into the measured pattern of the cosmos. Poetry is a spell that takes possession of us. It moves us. It fits us into things, but also stays outside of the intellect as a gift that's never quite our own. These are not necessarily incompatible accounts between the Republic and the Laws, though it does take a little work to reconcile them. What they suggest together is that poetry might entail two ways of perceiving reality. The one art perceives in two ways. What they suggest, an interior vision, one of intellectual vision, the seeing of the image, which is nothing but means of and prologue to the actual seeing of the true idea in its fullness of being. And also an exterior one, where measures given to us but not measured by us come to measure us, to fit us to good measure. In the Laws, too, there's a danger to poetry. The introduction of new meters might pervert the populace, but it's a danger of feeling rather than a danger of vision or misperception. This seems to lead us to an important observation that von Hildebrand makes early in the Heart. one of the degraded understandings of the heart is that which isolates affectivity, feeling itself, from its object. In the Republic, we hear an account of poetry that moves quickly past poetry in its fullness to its intellectual ingredients. In the Laws, there is, in contrast, an emphasis on feeling, on enchantment first, taking possession of the body, but doing so always in conformity to the larger laws or pattern of the cosmos, which are their proper object. I think we need both accounts, seeing and feeling, to do justice to poetry. But note that the less intellectualist account is also the less mediated. Poetry as mythos always involves seeing through images. Poetry as rhythm, given through feeling, joins one in communion with the order that it discerns. Poetry as a kind of seeing is easy to discuss and accept. It is so easily reconciled to the overall intellectualist bent of our philosophical tradition. Gioia's contribution has been to advocate something harder for that tradition to accept. He recalls a slight full feeling, however out of fashion it may be, and he suggests that it's a kind of knowing more powerful for being less internalized by the soul, being less thought about and looked at. So I want to end by returning these ideas to von Hildebrand and the heart. Where does this recovery of poetry as enchantment fit in relation to von Hildebrand's theory of affectivity? The focus of von Hildebrand's theory is to distinguish the affective value response by which we encounter being in the world and do so intentionally, and come to understand it and live properly in respect to it. And to distinguish that from the various kinds of affectivity that are reducible to passions or feelings. The language of enchantment in Gioia and again in Plato's Laws is most obviously associated with the passions, with that high kind of madness that von Hildebrand respects but also distinguishes from value response because of its lack of intention in respect to an object. And yet, Hildebrand does himself advert to poetic feelings and clarifies the character of what Plato and Gioia have described to us. On the one hand, poetic feeling lacks the intentionality proper to true value response, says von Hildebrand. But on the other, it is a way by which we know the world, as the poetical has and this is von Hildebrand speaking, a mysterious secret contact with the rhythm of the universe. And the feeling for it is a way in which the human soul is attuned to this rhythm. For von Hildebrand, no less than Plato, the enchantment of poetry is pre-intellectual and pre-intentional, preparing us to encounter the world's order properly, and only subsequently to respond to it. For both of them, the poetic conditions or habituates the soul, so that in Plato's terms, it may pursue the good and the orderly, and in von Hildebrand's language, that it may encounter the objects of the world with proper intention and respond with proper affection to the values it discovers. In either case, poetry in both its feeling dimension and its seeing dimension, perhaps above all in its feeling dimension, poetry is a way of knowing the world. So thank you.
Thank you, James. Okay, Maria.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to take the another dimension of Hildebrand's theory of affectivity, the properly intentional feelings, the ones that I spoke about yesterday as being the genuine spiritual affectivity. And what I want to do is actually show the way in which the affective response, in spite of its spontaneity, in spite of the content that the subject contributes, so to speak, to this dialogue, there is still a way in which affectivity for him entails a deeper union with reality, an intimacy with reality, and one which is moreover sui generis. In other words, I think that for Hildebrand, one can say that there's a way in which, if you take the analogy of the senses, if we had touch and smell, but not vision, there's something essential that we would miss about reality. So it's an unsubstitutable way of having reality or of receiving reality or of being in union with reality. And all of this is true. Now we have limited time, but I just want to mention that feelings are not cognitive for Hildebrand. Okay, there are philosophers who say that feelings are properly cognitive. They are not for Hildebrand. Okay, but I still want to I hope to show that nevertheless, through feelings, we enter into a new intimacy and a depth of union, which we otherwise would not have, and which the intellect and the will can't give us. So Hildebrand over and over, and I'm going to be drawing primarily from chapter 17 and a little bit from chapter 27 of his Ethics. He repeatedly speaks of the value response in terms of participation with being, union with being, the communion with the object, the partaking in of the object, and intimacy with the object. Okay, so that kind of language already alerts us to the fact that for him, affectivity will entail a deeper, I'm not going to say knowledge in the narrow sense, but a deeper having of reality, a deeper union with it. Okay, so the thing too that's maybe a little bit puzzling is, how is it that the affective responses, which are spontaneous, how do they establish a deeper union? Okay, so just to review spontaneity, all right, there's a content on the side of the subject. So in gratitude, I don't just know and I'm not just touched by the kindness of another person, but I give something back in gratitude, okay? And I want to explore how it is that in spite of this new content on the subject side, why is it that we can speak of a deeper union with the object, okay? So now this intimacy will mean both that I penetrate more deeply in the affective response into the object, and it penetrates more deeply into my being. These are two sides of the same coin. It's a very personalist understanding of union with being. It's both a penetration into the object and of the object's penetration into the subject. Okay, so in order to understand how this can be the case, we need to delve a little bit more deeply into the structure of affective responses. And I'm going to draw on some elements that I think Hildebrand doesn't make explicit. He doesn't focus on them, but I think they're definitely present. And I'm going to note three things in order to explain how it is that the affective response establishes a deeper union with being. Okay, so first of all, let us look at the particular kind of spontaneity that's present in the affective response. Spontaneity means that there's something coming from me as the subject to the object. Okay, there's something contributed from me. This is by contrast with knowledge, where I am purely receptive. Hildebrand speaks of being void in knowledge, whereas in the affective response, I am full of some kind of affection. Okay, so it's true that willing is also spontaneous. Okay, so what's the difference then? In willing, there's also something proceeding from me. Even though I'm responding to an object, there's something that I contribute, by contrast with knowing, where the object is the sole contributor. Well, the difference is the following. In the affective response, something is evoked or drawn out of me. Maria Walter already spoke about this morning. It is the object which acts on me. So even though the content, it's very important to hang on to this, is from me, the action is, you could say, imposed on me, so to speak, by the object. Here again, we have to remind ourselves of the deep consonance that there is, the deep correspondence that there is between the object and its nature and value and the response that I give. Okay, so now I say imposed on us, but again, I'm very grateful to Maria for pointing this out, in the manner of a gift. And so we can no longer use the term imposition. We are granted a gift. Something is drawn out of us that we would never have found within our being had we not been fecundated by the action of the object on our soul. So we have to press on, though. What is the manner of the activity, so to speak, of the object on us? Hildebrand uses an extremely important word that I think should take on a technical status. He says the object engenders the affective response in me. Now, what is the case with engendering? Engendering means to sort of capture the organic relationship, the similarity of nature between the cause and the effect. A father engenders a son. So there's a deep interpenetration, so to speak, in the nature, between the natures of the two things, what is engendered and what is doing the engendering. So now we see that in spite of the content that's contributed by the agent, there's a deep a very deep affinity, a very deep unity between the object, which engenders the affective response, and the affective response itself. So now we have to turn to the second element that is present in Hildebrand that'll help us understand why it is that affective responses establish an intimacy with being. It's the following. It's that affectivity has a qualitative character. Here again, Hildebrand frequently refers to the qualitative character of affectivity. So what does he mean by this? Well, we can distinguish between the formal dimension of being and its qualitative content. All right, I'll give an example. In love, we can say capture its formal dimension very easily in concepts. And this is, I think that that James Matthew Wilson was referring to this kind of thing. There's a formal dimension that can be captured by the intellect, that can be conceptualized. Love is faithful, or love is forever, or love desires the good of the beloved. Here we are capturing the formal element of love. But there's also a qualitative dimension, all right, which is just as important and just as real. And this is more difficult to capture in concepts. And that's why we use poetry, we use literature, we use the mystical writings with all of their imagery. We have to use metaphors and so forth. All right, and here we can, again, it's going to be difficult for me to put it into concepts, but the concepts, but the tenderness of love, its melting action on the soul. We heard yesterday, I quoted some passages from Aquinas where he refers to that. The fact that the soul grows wings and is taken out of itself and so forth. Okay, that all of that captures the qualitative content, which again, I think is as important as the formal content. It's simply different. Okay, so what am I saying here? Well, then the qualitative character of affectivity, and here I'm simply speaking of the felt dimension of affectivity, the qualitative character of affectivity in its correspondence with the object in its qualitative character, okay, imparts to us in an intimate way the presence of the being in our soul. Okay, in a much fuller way, the object through the affective response becomes present in my soul. Okay, we could now say in a more material or substantial way. Okay, and the third aspect of Hildebrand's teaching on the emotions is that the emotions are by nature intimate. Okay, and what do we mean by that? And here, it's difficult to prove, difficult to deduce. We couldn't deduce it, but we have to simply take things as we find them. It's affectivity which touches the self in its depth. Affectivity stirs, we could say, the ego to an awakening. And now by this, I mean an awakening to itself. Of course, it's dependent on being awakened by an awakening to the object. Right here, we see the transcendence of the human person. It's only through the entrance of something beyond me, of a value beyond me, which then enters into the depth of my soul through affectivity, whether through being affected or the affective response, that I am awakened to myself in my depth. And at the same time, I am also, through the action of the object acting on me in this affective way, I become aware of myself as an addressee of value, as one who is given value as a gift in an intimately personal way, perhaps as one who a claim is made on them to make a response. Okay, so affectivity then is essentially intimate. It awakens me in my depth, it engages me, it mobilizes me, and then of course it also can then invite me to make a response of the will and so forth. Okay, so here now, I think that through examining these three things, we can see that the affective response establishes a deeper union and communion with the world around us. Okay, and that is through giving us, just to recap, the qualitative aspect of reality, but also by inserting that reality more deeply into the depth of my soul. And I'd like to end with one last point, which I think is also very important. It's this idea of Hildebrand's that the heart constitutes the true self of the person. What I would like to do is suggest another way of thinking about it, perhaps adding something to Hildebrand, or possibly simply clarifying what I think is going on when he says that the heart contains the true self. Rather than identifying the heart with the true self, I would say that it is the heart which awakens the true self. It awakens me in my depth. Okay, that would avoid, I think, certain problems that might come with the identification of the heart as a faculty in the narrow sense with the true self. And also, I would like to make a comparison with the will. So is the will not the true self? I think that the comparison rather should be made in this way. The will has its significance in the fact that it is my own most fully. And again, Maria Walter spoke about this morning. Its significance is that it is my own. And then we can say that willing also can be more deep or more superficial. But this is what I think is very interesting. And here we also are confronted with our creatureliness. I think that even the will can operate in the depth of the person, you could say in its full capacity, only after the depth has been awakened through the affective experience of the person, which occurs again through the gift of being touched by transcendent being. Very interesting. So yes, I do commit my whole being when in an act of the will. And yet we see in the mystical writings, especially of the saints, we see in certain the autobiographies of heroes and so forth, that the will operates in a new depth only after the soul has been touched through the affective response, okay? Where again, my ego, myself, is awakened in its depth. So again, here I think the creaturehood of the person is brought to evidence. And here I find a very deep correspondence between Aquinas and Hildebrand, if we read Hildebrand in this way. Aquinas repeatedly speaks of the inclinations as drawing the human person to the good. He seems to almost make them as a condition for us to be able to choose the good. And I think if we understand the inclinations as this stirring of our soul in the depth, but now not as a pre-conscious or as some kind of a natural thing that's implanted to us, in us, but as an intentional, affective response, but one that is precisely given to us as a gift that we find happening to us. I think Aquinas is absolutely right. This, for the creature, has to be the first thing that they experience, that the will, even though it's fully my own, is capable of, in a sense, being mobilized only after the invitation that the person has experienced in the depth, in the stirring of the affections. So I think my time is up, and I will pass the podium on to Father James Brent. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. That was wonderful. And thank you, James, earlier for your presentation. I'm just going to say a few things this morning about the role of affectivity or love in the act of knowing, as St. Thomas Aquinas understands it or explains it. First of all, there's something already in Aristotle where he describes how appetite or inclination or desire can make a difference in perception and what one sees of the good. So in the Nicomachean Ethics, he has a couple of sayings where he talks about as a man is, so the good seems, or as a man is, so the mean seems. Or in other places, he talks about to the vicious man, the mean seems extreme. So these are all sayings where he describes how the kind of person that you are and the kind of appetites one has will make a difference in how one perceives the good. So if one is virtuous courses of action or good things will actually appear and seem good. But if one has a vice or is not a good person or has a character flaw or a bad appetite, a disordered desire, then good things can seem evil and evil things can seem good. So a couple of basic examples. One that St. Thomas Aquinas uses all the time, which is if you have a man who's chaste, a certain unchaste sight, he'll spontaneously judge that to be bad and turn away, and will not go in that direction. So when one has an appetite or a love that's been well formed and is responding to reality according to the order of reality itself, then one will have perceptions and judgments according to the desire, according to right appetite, or holy loves, we can say. And the tradition is very clear that these judgments, or this perception that's in tune with our holy loves, or flows from our holy loves, which are in tune with reality, these judgments are not discursive. They are intuitive, they're immediate. It's just the way a person sees the world. And if you ask such a person, why do you turn your eyes away? Why do you act this way? Why do you respond to reality this way? Or why do you act this way in response to the world? The answer would be hard stated. It's hard to give a reason because the perception is not really worked out through kind of discursive reasoning and deductions from principles. It's an act of what love knows, or what love perceives in the good. Okay, so that much is already in Aristotle. And St. Thomas receives that from Aristotle. But he also has, and in his treatment of the virtues, St. Thomas talks about this a lot. So each virtue has an inclination for the end, or for a certain course of action that's according to the mean. And a person who has the virtue will love the end and love the means, or love acting according to the mean, and then doing so just spontaneously, intuitively, seems the right way to act. So to give another example, if you have someone who's just and has been formed that way in his character, he goes into a store, he goes to purchase something, he gets extra change back from the cashier, the person will spontaneously, intuitively realize, I should give this back. I should give back the extra change so that that's just the right thing to do. And the person doesn't work it all out philosophically as to why this is the right thing to do and lay out all the reasons. It's just the obvious thing to do. That's because the person loves what is right, loves justice. The just course of action is quickly and easily and intuitively perceived. So this is already in Aristotle and in the ethics of St. Thomas, the virtue ethics. There's a basis there for saying that our loves affect our perceptions and can even be a source of spontaneous true judgments about the world, or non-inferential true judgments about the world. What St. Thomas does is he takes this understanding, which is sometimes called connatural knowledge. That's a term that Thomists sometimes use to name this phenomenon. He takes that notion and he expands it, because the Christian tradition gives him something that's not in Aristotle, which is the reality of mystical experience, or experiential knowledge of God, or the knowledge that the saints have, which is not always worked out in a theological deduction, but is just sort of a spontaneous, non-inferential understanding or intuitive awareness of God and the ways of God. And St. Thomas, when he comes to the consideration of the Spirit's gifts, and particularly the Spirit's gift of wisdom, he really uses this understanding of connatural knowledge to explain what's going on. So when it comes to the Spirit's gift of wisdom, people who are in charity, and only the people who are in charity, that is, the people who are established in a relationship of love with God, such people can intuitively form judgments about God and the ways of God based on their experiential awareness of God. So people who are in a deep friendship with God know God in a kind of experiential way, thanks to charity and the Spirit's gift of wisdom. And from out of that union, which Aquinas even calls intimacy in some places, they can spontaneously or intuitively or non-inferentially form judgments about God and the ways of God. And this is precisely the Spirit's gift of wisdom. A person without a great deal of theological learning, without conceptual analysis that's very deep or anything like that, can just simply know God and the ways of God and can experience God and form judgments in response to that experience of God, or in response to God himself. And this is really found most deeply in contemplative prayer, okay? So the primary work, when contemplation goes deep or grows deep in a person, the person begins to live and operate more and more out of wisdom and love of this spontaneous sort of kind that comes as through the working of the Spirit. And of course, the person can also operate theologically, but doesn't necessarily need to. And that's why you can have someone who, like, say, for example, Saint Therese of Lisieux, who does not have any advanced theological learning. She never went and studied theology very deeply, but she has a profound encounter with God and has a profound awareness of God and the ways of God that flows from out of a radical love that she has and the Spirit working in her according to the gift of wisdom very deeply, and from out of her intuitive, you could say non-discursive or non-inferential knowledge of God, she can pour forth tremendous testimony to God and the ways of God, and can even become a doctor of the church, as she is. So St. Thomas has within his theological framework a place, we can say, for that knowledge which comes from love or holy loves. It can be, on the one hand, just moral knowledge in accord with the virtues, flowing from the virtues and the appetites that go with the virtues, or it can come from the gifts of the Spirit working within us. Now, just to make one quick point to close off, some of the Thomists in the 20th century, like Jacques Maritain, tried to take this concept of connatural knowledge and expand it a bit so they could give an account of aesthetic awareness as well. So they wanted to use this to account for our knowledge of the beautiful, because we seem to have some people seem to have a similar sort of spontaneous, intuitive awareness of what's beautiful, but that depends on what the person loves and the kind of person one has become. So I just want to let people know about this marvelous topic of connatural knowledge, and especially the marvelous topic of the Spirit's gift of wisdom. And we could and should pray for wisdom. St. Thomas is very clear that this comes through prayer more than through study. The Spirit's gift of wisdom does. So I'll leave it at that, and we can go to questions.
Thank you very much, Father James. Thank you to all of the panelists. This is a theme, a recurring theme here, the role of prayer in the formation of the heart. But Maria is raising her hand, so I'll let her go first.
I just have a very quick question. It's by way of maybe asking Father Brent to kind of tie up his presentation. I was carefully listening, and I could be wrong, but I didn't hear the mention of the heart or of affectivity, but you did use words like experience, intuitive knowledge, connatural. Could you just quickly, just maybe in one or two sentences, relate it to affectivity in the heart?
Sure. So charity, as Thomas is very clear, is an act of the will. And as I was explaining yesterday, for him, it's will in the very broad sense that he uses it, which includes, well, it basically is your capacity for love. And when a person loves another, there's going to be, first of all, benevolencia or goodwill. but he's clear that it's goodwill with affection. That's practically, we could practically say that's a definition of charity. It's goodwill, of the act of charity. It's goodwill with affection that flows from out of this friendship. And that virtue of charity, St. Thomas says, modifies or forms the will. And the will belongs to the spiritual part of the soul, which we could also call the heart. And that's what Scripture calls it. Okay. So unless a person is filled with charity in his or her heart, the person's not going to be able to have this kind of spiritual wisdom, and is not going to have the Spirit's gift of wisdom, and is not going to have that intuitive, experiential knowledge of God. And just to qualify the kind of experience that I'm just talking about here, it's not necessarily sensory experience. I'm not talking about visions or locutions or something like that. We're talking about an experience that's of a higher order, that's really proper to or is found in the heart or that spiritual part of the soul.
Thank you.
That was
very helpful.
Thank you. And have all too little time for questions, some very good ones here. I'm going to read a question for you here, Maria, because I think this is a question that maybe also expresses others. So this comes from our friend Pete Colosi. He says, he wants to better understand why you say love is not cognitive. How should we explain the deeper knowledge we gain about objects we love that we would not gain if we did not love them? Do you mean that love gives an added power to the intellect, but is itself not cognitive, receptive in a knowing sense?
Well, so just very briefly, first of all, what I wanted to do is say that for Hildebrand, he emphasizes in many times that the knowledge in the narrow sense is presupposed for any affective response and so he wants to maintain the intentionality of the affection. So that's very important to him. In other words, I have to have in some way gotten in touch with the intelligibility and meaning of the thing, which I think for him happens only through the intellect. I think this is a little bit by contrast with Stein and Scheler. Even earlier on, it seemed as though Hildebrand had this idea of Wertfühlen in his early work, but he doesn't repeat it. He does say there's value perception explicitly in the ethics. He says there's a special kind of perception called value perception. He says that has to be the foundation for any affective response. And he explicitly says, I can distinguish those by one quick hint, which is that I'm very often sad that I don't respond effectively to a value that I perceive. So he says the perceiving of value does not depend on affectivity. Okay, so that was really the main thing that I wanted to say, is that I wanted to be faithful to Hildebrand. He doesn't call them cognitive as such. Okay, there are some philosophers who say that it's only in the feeling that I have the thing. Now, having said that, we can probably distinguish between an explicit cognition and an implicit one. And I think that Hildebrand would probably agree that very often we're aware of things only through our affective response to them, because we weren't conceptually aware of them, but we did have cognitive knowledge of them. Okay. And then I think, Pete, everything else that I said still applies, that the object, by evoking a response on the basis of this qualitative, so to speak, touching of my soul, does give me to taste it more intimately. And in that broader sense then, Pete, there is an added delving into the thing, a deeper having of the thing than there was in bare cognition. I hope, I wanted to do that quickly, but I hope that helped.
Maria, I don't want to pile the questions on you, but since you're here representing Van Hildebrand, I'm going to ask the question here from another one of our attendees who wants to know, whether you're using the word soul. You've often spoken of the soul, the object, its intimacy with the soul, whether you're using that as an equivalent for the whole person or an aspect of the person. In what sense are you using that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So what's happening there is, you might have seen that my talk sort of culminated in this point about the heart as being the true self. So I deliberately, from the beginning, didn't want to simply speak of the heart as being touched. It's really the self that is touched. And here we fumble a little bit, because the person is, of course, one. Mark already mentioned that on the first day. We aren't carved up into these different departments. It's always the self that experiences. And yet, as I think Joseph Seifert wanted to emphasize in some of his questions, we can clearly distinguish the different kinds of experiences that we have. And so we say, oh, it's by means of the heart that I, and that's what the soul was meant. The word soul simply refers to the I, the ego or the self, which does the experiencing. So do you think that did it, John Henry?
Yes, I think so. I think so. Here's a question for you, James, which brings us back to your discussion of poetry, and I'll just read it here again. Do you think that poetry is solely imitative, lower because it is comparatively less abstracted than philosophy, or can the effective and individual depths uncovered in poetry be reaching a deeper or comparative aspect to the intellectual depths found in philosophy? So we'll let the poet answer that question.
So happily, I can be a little bit brief, because if you really want a long answer, you can just read the last chapter of my book, The Fortunes of Poetry in an Age of Unmaking. But in brief, I don't think, I suggested this pretty fully, but not completely today. Plato's account of poetry as imitative, or to refer to imitation as Plato's account of the poetic, is very incomplete. The most important passage for us in Plato to think about the reaches or the scope of poetry lies in the Phaedrus, where Socrates recites his Palinode, a poem, where he refers to poets initially as sixth-rate human beings, which is pretty bad. It's just a little above tyrants and used car salesmen. But in fact, he then proceeds to say that the reason poets are so bad is because they just used to imitate images. But I, says Socrates, I will give you the true poem. And then he reveals to us what the soul is. You know, the image of the chariot with the charioteer and the two horses. And then he tells us what the whole cosmos looks like. And he reveals it all to us with a fullness that we get almost no place else in his dialogues. And what Socrates does there is he brings into the world an image of a fullness of truth that you would otherwise have to be a god who has a great deal of time to convey to someone. What Plato does at that moment is he gives an entirely new mission to poetry, and also he gives a new mission to philosophy. Philosophy and poetry both bring into the world, in both abstraction and in the concrete image, a full perception of reality. And they do this so well that having been convinced by Plato, I can't tolerate, as much as I love Jacques Maritain, for instance, I can't tolerate Jacques Maritain's distinction between poetry as a way of existentially intuiting being, whereas metaphysics operates by way of abstraction and essences. I think that that's actually a useful distinction in some respects, but for the most part, it doesn't adequately map onto the way poetry and philosophy work. I think actually those two modes of inquiry are finally one inquiry, so that the best poetry will also be philosophy, and the best philosophy will always be poetry.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, let me send one last question, and I think we have to wrap up here, to you, Father James. This is, let me summarize it a little bit, but the essential point being made here, which you can comment on whether you agree, is that the expansion of the notion of connatural knowledge to include not just the non-discursive knowledge of virtue, but to include the poetic, the aesthetic, the being affected by values, would be a perfect linchpin between Aquinas and Hildebrand. Do you think that, I mean, based on the way in which you understand connaturality and the expansion of it, would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. There's a huge point of contact there, and it's the Thomists themselves have written a lot about connatural knowledge because they realize it helps them to account for a pretty vast range of cognition that human beings typically have, which is a kind of cognition according to our loves. Not everyone is a kind of scientific thinker the way that Aristotle is, but still they have an accurate understanding and knowledge of reality according to their loves. And so connatural knowledge ends up doing a lot of work in accounting for real life experience of human beings.
Yeah. Well, much to be pursued. And of course, now we come to the small groups. So I want to thank our three panelists for your presentations, for participating so fully. And at this point, we will move to the small groups, and I encourage, and the small groups being for the full participants of the summer seminar. And I want to thank all of our guests who are tuned in as well, who are watching us, who are not full participants, but who have been very actively present. And I invite you all to join us again tomorrow when the seminar, when the keynote sessions of the seminar resume. And for those of you who are full participants, of course, after the morning, after the small groups are over, we move then to the afternoon sessions. We look forward to seeing you there. And of course, those of you who are friends and benefactors of the Hildebrand Project who've been invited, please join us as well in those afternoon sessions. So on that note, I say thank you to you all, and look forward to the continuation of our seminar.
Thank you
very much.